series of webinars that we're running over the coming weeks. We've already had one on our recent report on religious London. This, as you all know, is on social cohesion, and we've got one coming up on football soon. I think links to those are going to be posted in the chat once we've started. Just going to give you one more minute to get comfortable, and then we'll begin. Okay, then let's kick off with today's proceedings. So hello and welcome to everybody who's joining us today. This is a lunchtime webinar run by Theos Think Tank, as I said. Theos is a think tank which exists to enrich the conversation around faith and society. And we have a programme of original research, events and media commentary. I'm Madeleine Pennington, I'm a head of research at Theos, and I'm hosting our discussion today with John Yates about his book, Fractured, Why Our Societies Are Coming Apart and How to Put Them Back Together. This is a topic close to our hearts at Theos because we've published several reports on social cohesion over the past year. So last summer we authored one for the British Academy and the Faith and Belief Forum about the ways in which faith and belief generally impacts on cohesion. And in the autumn we published a study of the impact of local churches. You'll be able to find links to that research in the chat box. But this afternoon, the focus of our event is broadening the discussion to discuss this fantastic new book. Good to hear. I've read it, I can recommend it highly. This is Fractured, Why Our Societies Are Coming Apart and How We Put Them Back Together Again. This is the latest work by John Yates, who we're delighted to have with us here today. John is Executive Director of the Youth Endowment Fund, a £200 million charitable fund focusing on integrating young people into society. After graduating from the University of Oxford, he started his career as a community worker in the London Borough of Newham before joining McKinsey & Company, where he advised charities, companies and government on strategy and their organisational development. He's co-founded a series of charities and initiatives, including The Challenge and More in Common, aimed at improving life chances and understanding. And these programmes, quite amazingly, now reach 1 in 6 Britons in their lifetime. So we're really delighted to have you with us here today. Just a few bits of housekeeping before we begin. So John's going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to have a bit of conversation between the two of us about the ideas he's shared and some of the wider implications of that. Then we'll have questions from you, our audience. And that'll be for about 20 minutes, so we'll finish about 1:15. Please don't use the chat facility while we're speaking. It's a bit distracting. We've heard that from feedback on previous events, and we want to give John our full attention today. But do put your questions in the Q&A box on Zoom so that we can ask them when we open it up to the floor. Obviously, I think people know how to use the Q&A box. If you have a question you're really dying to ask and can't work out how to use the Q&A box, we won't hold it against you if you do use the chat. But try and be as least distracted as possible. We're now live streaming on YouTube, but we're only taking questions from people on Zoom. So particularly great to have you all with us here. And the seminar, you'll notice, isn't being recorded via Zoom, but is therefore being recorded on YouTube. So you can watch it back later as well. So without further ado, in that case, then I'm going to hand over now to John. So John, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Maddie, and it's an absolute pleasure to be hosted by Theos, whose thinking I've always found incredibly helpful on this point. And it's lovely to be with all of you wherever you find yourself at this lunchtime. The core argument of this book, Fractured, is that the average British man and woman and the average American man and woman is right. And so half of British people today tell posters that their country has never felt so divided. 80% of Americans tell posters that their country is either mainly or entirely divided. And we can see the evidence for that nowhere clearer than in our own friendship groups. So half of Brits and Americans with degrees have not a single friend who doesn't have a degree. The vast majority of pensioners don't mix with anybody have any contact at all with anyone who's a millennial unless they're their grandchildren. A fifth of Remainers and a quarter of Leavers don't have a single friend who voted the other way. Half of all of us in the UK don't have a single friend from a different ethnic group. The biggest divide of all, though, remains income or class. A barrister operating in the UK would have to invite 100 people into their garden, breaking the law by a factor of 3, before they would invite someone who was unemployed. My second core argument is that we have hugely misdiagnosed the cause of these divisions. And actually, again, the average person probably has a better sense of it than many of us who have thought very hard about it. When I talk to people about the level of division in the country, the thing that many people will end up saying to me is, well, John, I hear you, but birds of a feather flock together. And the average person on that is basically onto something. There's been 39,000 academic studies published that show that we have a small constant bias towards people who for some reason remind us of ourselves. Academics call this homophily, a preference for people like us. I just call it people like me syndrome. And you can find evidence for people like me syndrome from Kuala Lumpur to Kingston, affecting who we choose to work with, who we do academic research with, who we spend our time with socially, where we live, and where we send our children to school. The problem with people like me syndrome, though, as an explanation of our divisions, is it doesn't fully work because it's a constant bias. So if I was to say to you, the reason that it's sunny today when it was less hot last week is because of the sun, it's a very unsatisfactory explanation, because although the sun is absolutely critical to understanding why it's sunny today, it doesn't explain why it's changed and why the weather has moved. So something else must be changing. To understand that, we need to take a trip to northern Tanzania, to Lake Eyasi, and to a tribe that has lived in the surroundings of that lake for 60,000 years. The tribe's called the Hadza, and there's about 400 members of that tribe. It's a very unusual tribe in that it continues to live as hunter-gatherers in the modern day. Now, what's fascinating about the Hadza is once a month, when there's no moon in the sky, they will get together and they'll perform something called the apem. And performed in complete darkness, the apem is a dance, and the men will hide behind a set of trees or some sort of cover, and one by one they'll come out and they'll take turns to put on a headdress made of ostrich feathers. They hold a rattle in their hands, bells around one ankle, and a black cape on their back. And they would dance a particular ritualized dance, and then women and often their children will join in the dance with them. And the apem will last for a reasonable period of time, with each man leading off the dance 2 or 3 times. Now, sociologists have been really puzzled about the apem because it serves no obvious purpose. It doesn't create any particular products. It doesn't provide any food. It doesn't serve the economy, for want of a better word, of the Hadza. It doesn't fit with any religious explanation. The Hadza don't have an organized religious explanation of the world that as we would recognize. What is the point of the apem? Now, the sociologists followed the Hadza for a period of time, and they particularly tracked who do the Hadza tend to trust. So who do they tend to share tools with? Who do they bed down with for the night? Who do they gossip with if they hear something interesting? And they found that there was, first of all, one thing that tended to be a key in who they trusted, and that was who they were closely related to. The Hadza is made up of a series of separate families, and so those bonds are pretty important. But they found a second thing that played a huge role as to who they trusted, and that was whether they had danced the apem dance together. And in fact, the Hadza were more likely to trust someone who had danced the apem dance with them than someone they were blood related to. And so what the apem dance seems to be doing is creating a common life, a connection for those families, making, if you like, the diversity of those different families work and cohere. We don't really have a term for an institution that brings strangers or people who are potentially different together and creates a bond. I, in the book, suggest we should call it the common life. And when you start looking for common lives, you can actually see these institutions right through human history. So from the Apem dance, rather similar animalistic rituals amongst hunter-gatherers, to amongst when we were agrarians, when we were farmers, you see a huge amount of time being spent on religious ceremonies, rites of passage, and other gatherings. So, for example, the average 14th century English woman would, and or man would, for that matter, would spend 1 in 4 days on a feast day or some sort of religious ceremony. It's a huge amount of time. But these gatherings, these feast days, these religious services were connecting people together with people they didn't choose to spend time with. Then when we moved into cities, you see another common life spring up. You see the birth of clubs and societies. As city dwellers, we joined huge numbers of clubs. Nearly all the clubs that exist today, from the Scouts to the Guides to the Freemasons to the Boys Brigade to the whatever you might, the Mothers Union, they all broadly date from the early period of the Industrial Revolution. They sprung out of nothing, but provided a space again where we mixed with people we didn't choose. We just turned up and met people and we bonded together. You also see, though, some other institutions play this common life role in the cities, some of them mandatory things, like, for example, schools. Children from 1880 in the UK had to go to school. They didn't choose who they were educated with. Most of us had to go to work, and we tended to work in the local, in a local factory, in a local place of work, where, again, we wouldn't pick who we were working with. And so over human history, you have, if you like, this struggle between people like me syndrome on the one hand, pulling us towards people that remind us of ourselves. And then on the other hand, the common life, these institutions that bond us together. So why have we become divided? Well, the core reason why we've become divided is that common life I just described, the one that connected the city dwellers together, which is the common life of probably many of our grandparents or our great-grandparents, has gone into decline. If you look at clubs and societies, every generation since 1950 was less likely than the previous generation to join a club or a society. What about the things that were mandatory? You still have to go to school. Most of us still have to go to work. Yes, but we now tend to choose, a lot of us, where we send our children to school. We now have a lot of choice about where we choose to work. So if a common life is somewhere you don't choose, then those common lives also have gone into decline. So we've lost these common life places where we aren't choosing. And so people like me syndrome starts to win the battle again. So the question we should have been debating when we talk about our divisions should have been, why is the common life declining? Why has it been drifting away from us? And to answer that, we need to recognise that, as I said earlier, there are 2 different types of common lives that have brought our grandparents and our great-grandparents together. The first was mandatory things. And that the great weakness of those mandatory gatherings, like the workplace, like the school, the kryptonite, if you like, to destroy it, was choice. Unfortunately, something we really, really like. The 2 villains of the piece in our divisions are things we actually really like. The first one is choice. So the more we choose where we send our children to school, the more we choose where we work, the more we should expect for those institutions to become full of people who are quite similar. The second is, what about the voluntary associations? They were always optional. So it's not going to be choice that caused a problem there. The truth about voluntary associations is they're rubbish at adapting to change. So if you look at the business world, if one business gets wiped out, another one springs up. Someone's going to make some money, they'll invest, they'll start something up, it will scale and grow. If you look at the animal kingdom, normally if one animal dies out, something else is going to spring up to take advantage of the opportunity. Voluntary associations just don't work like that. They don't scale fast. Generally, people don't want them to grow because they love them the way they are. They don't suddenly mutate. People tend to be very keen that their institution doesn't change, and they don't fail fast. And so when the clubs and associations have been dying away since the 1950s, nothing new has arrived to take their place. And so we've ended up with a period without, because of choice and change, in a period without a common life to connect us. Now that really matters, because the response might be, well, that's a rather sad story, but does it really matter that we're spending time with people that seem similar to us, if that's what we want to do? The problem is, in a divided society, some of the things we really care about get really damaged. And I won't expand on this too much here. The book is maybe the place to go for this. But our democracy relies on the fact that we trust people who may seem different to us. Our social mobility relies on everyone having access to somewhat similar networks, and we have similar effects on our security, on our health and well-being, and also on our economy. So, what do we do about it? Well, to come into close, I think there's three main options that we've got if we want to try and rebuild a common life to connect us. The first one is the option of doing absolutely nothing at all. We could choose to not try and rebuild these common life experiences. We could wait, maybe, because a new common life will eventually evolve. I told you that previous ones have died out and then new ones came for the villages and for the cities. The problem is that could take quite a long time. There was an 1,000-year gap between the dying out of things like the Apem dance for most people before organised religion took its place. There was about a 50, 100-year gap before the city common life sprung up. But we could wait it out. We just should stop complaining about our divisions. We should say this is basically the strategy at the moment of pretty much every single Western society. I don't think we've consciously chosen it, but this is what we're doing. The second option would be to try and slow down the pace of change. If voluntary associations struggle with rapid change, why don't we slow it down? So our society has it changed? Well, the economy has changed fast. We've moved from manufacturing to services. Maybe we could slow down the impact of that. Our values have changed from being more community focused in the 50s to being more individualistic. Maybe we could try and push that back. The competition for our time has rapidly changed. The invention of the television, I would argue, has been huge here. We now spend on average 3 or 4 hours a day watching TV. Before the TV was invented, obviously that was 0. That makes a huge difference to the ability of these institutions to flourish. We could try and slow down all of these changes. That is effectively the route that the Nordic countries, probably by chance, have taken. So Sweden, Denmark, Norway and Finland, they put in great protection to actually slow down the rate of economic change, or at least the impact on individuals. Their values have been much more constant. Also, people actually move around those countries, much less immigration in those countries. The consequence has been that those 3 countries have maintained their clubs and societies more than the rest of the West. And when you rank those countries on whether people trust each other, whether they take responsibility for each other, whether they have good understanding of each other, they come first, second, third, and fifth. So we could slow down the rate of change. I personally don't think that's a credible option. The amount of technological change that we're about to see over the next half century, I think would be far too significant for us to be able to significantly slow it down. So what's the third option? There's another country, I said there were first, second, third, and fifth. Well, who was fourth? So the country that's fourth is a country that has been incredibly open to change, very high rates of immigration, very high rates of economic change, and very open to technology. That country is Singapore. But what Singapore has done is they've actually reduced the level of choice that people have. So they've required Singaporean citizens to spend some time in their life with people who are different from themselves. They've done it through the way schools are organised. They've done it through the existence of national service. They've done it even through the way that public housing is allocated. Now, what I would like to argue isn't that we exactly copy Singapore, but I would like to argue that we should consider the idea of a Western version of what Singapore has done. I mean, you may think, God, that sounds like some sort of fascist regime. Let me give you a sense of what I might mean. It might mean community service for teenagers as part of the national curriculum. It might mean that when your child starts at nursery, you get a bit more childcare support, but in return, you've got to turn up to 5 or 6 sessions to learn how your child's brain works and how a child develops. And in so doing, you mix with parents from other backgrounds. It might mean a national retirement service, so that when you retire, there's actually something for you to get involved in your community and mix and meet with other people. Now, I think those 3 new institutions could make a real difference to our divisions. Now, you might say, my final point, you might say in response to that as a suggestion that that is just completely inconceivable. That we would mandate such things in our Western liberal societies. Let me suggest perhaps two small responses to that. The first is, maybe you're right. Maybe it is inconceivable. But then could I ask you what the alternative that you propose is? We have been largely bringing warm words to a gunfight We're talking about shared values. We're talking about parties for when it's the Queen's birthday. These are not serious solutions to our divisions. The final thing I would say is pretty much every serious political change that has ever happened in this country that is of note, whether it's the joining of the EU to the leaving of the EU, whether it's the creation of the welfare state to the creation of the NHS, every one of those changes started off as being inconceivable. Then it became imaginable. Then it became likely. And then it eventually became unavoidable. In publishing this book, I hope to start the journey for the idea of a mandatory common life to bring us all back together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John, for a challenging, but I think also hopeful rundown of some of the ideas in your book. And we're going to have about 10 minutes for just questions from me first, which are chair's prerogative. But while I am talking, then please do, audience members, add your own questions to the Q&A. I can see that there are already a few there, and really excited to get to some of them. The first question from me is a predictable one, given Theos's role and interests, which is basically what you see as the role of religion in all of this. Now, obviously, Theos has done a bit of research on this ourselves and found that in the existing conversation, really, faith is seen quite negatively. It's seen as a sort of exclusive identity marker, probably more along part of the people like me syndrome, if you will. But on the ground in the communities, we found all sorts of examples of it seeming to bolster our common life. So I'm really interested to hear, you mentioned some avenues of inquiry here, a bit more about whether you see faith and belief really as part of a solution or the problem. I'm sure at some level both, but would be really grateful to hear more of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think we tend to come at what role do we think religion plays in the issue of cohesion, generally with what's our preconceived view on religion. So if we're yay religion, then we go, religion is critical to solve this problem and it's the answer. If we're like boo religion, then we come up with some logical reason of, well, look at Northern Ireland, look at all the division. This is what I think we need to do much better is say, actually, let's just diagnose what the problem is. I think it's that we spend time with people unlike us. Let's diagnose what the solution is. I think we need commonplace experiences that bring people who might seem different together, and then say, okay, what role could religion play in that? And I think what that throws up is that it's complicated. So the first thing is, well, unless a society has just one belief system, religion or beliefs are going to be one possible dividing factor. But I do wonder, sort of, so where do you go with that point? Because what's the answer? I mean, we're gonna ban everyone from until everyone's got exactly the same view. I do think there's also a slight tendency to think, well, if we just ban religion, which in itself feels way more illiberal than what I'm suggesting, if we just ban religion, then everyone will all agree. I mean, that definitely doesn't seem likely. I mean, I don't see a sort of secular society as one where everyone has the same view on everything, or where everyone's has no sort of tribal affiliation on beliefs. So I sort of struggle a bit with it, taking it as a problem further than just saying, look, it's clearly a potential source of identity, and therefore it's a potential source of division. It's also, I think, important to note when we think about a common life. Religious gatherings can play an important role. Now, they can be a source of people who are very similar coming together. So on the one hand, you're unlikely to, if you're attending a mosque, most people you meet there are likely to be Muslim. If you go to a church, most people you meet there are likely to be Christian. But places of worship are often one of the few places in our society where people mix across lines of difference of age. They're one of the few places where actually you can see mixing by different education levels. We shouldn't overstate, though, how well, if I focus for a moment on the sort of state religion, we shouldn't overstate how well, for example, Anglican churches do on this. So churches tend to be slightly dominated by people who are older. They tend to be slightly dominated by people who have got graduate degrees, and they tend to have not had always a great record of mixing people up by different ethnic backgrounds. I mean, this is obviously America's very different situation, but Martin Luther King famously said that 11 a.m. on Sunday was the most segregated hour in America. I think we do need to challenge those of us who are involved in places of worship. Are we doing enough to use the spaces to bring people together? But most of the places, most of the common life experiences that connect people across one line of difference is likely to have its own identity. And so football, when you're doing something on football can be a great unifier for people of different backgrounds. And we mustn't miss that by saying, yeah, but it brings together Man United fans over here and Chelsea fans over there. So I think there's a huge role for religion and faith to play, while at the same time, people of faith need to be a bit self-critical about how do we use the institutions that we have to make them as effective as possible.
That's really helpful. Thanks so much. I think there's also something there, again, as you so helpfully, I think, unpack in the book around how so much of this ties in with wider social trends. So, for example, particularly engaging young people in sort of churches, if they have, for example, are engaged in shift work, like, is Sunday morning going to be a good time for them? And so much of that is not necessarily what works in 1 year is going to work 20 years down the line. And that brings me to my second question. At the end of the book, you helpfully outline some recommendations for how each of us can take our own shoulder our own bit of responsibility for bringing our societies back together. And one of those recommendations is to visit a place of worship. I'm wondering, there might be some people who are in our audience today who lead places of worship. You've said, they can do more. I wonder what your advice is for people in those roles in terms of how religion can, in your words, sort of be more along the solution than the divisive force there.
Yeah, so I think there's probably a few things that are worth just chewing over if you're, leading an institution like that. I mean, what does the research say works to build togetherness? What needs to be true of these common life places? Well, there's two main things that matter. The first is that actually, I'm going to call it three. It's three main things that matter. The first thing is you've got to be able to attract in a group of people who are different in the first place. So, to what extent are you actually in the way that you communicate what you're doing, the way you talk about what you're doing, in the faces and the messages that you use? Are you getting across that this is something that you see as being for everyone? The second thing, which actually isn't that far apart, is there needs to be a sense of equality of status. So institutions that bring together people who are different, where the power dynamics are off, don't create a sense of trust and connection. So let's use a very clear example. Prisons. If you have a prison where the prison guards and the prisoners are somehow different, that is not going to be a place where people, which works as a common life. I'm not saying we should ban all prisons, but I'm just saying it's an obvious point. We don't expect prison guards and prisoners to form great bonds of connection and trust. And when they do, it gets turned into a Hollywood story. Like, it's not normal. Because of the power dynamics. And so equality of status is really important. So we need to think about, some of this is well thought about by many places of worship, but who's up front? Who's being presented? Whose life is being seen as normal? When we're talking about activities we might do, how much money is being required to join in? Are there clear signals that really you need to have a certain vocabulary to be part of this engagement? Do you need to have read certain books? Do you need to, and I think the heart of that often is, to what extent can you diversify the people making the decisions? Because it's really hard sometimes to spot, well, hang on, if I say it this way, that's off-putting to these people. And we end up all sort of policing our language, and it's quite hard. But actually, if you've got a diverse group of people making the decisions, it's quite easy, because someone will say, no, you don't mean it this way. But when you do it like that, I think I'm not part of the group. The third thing then is, what do you actually do together? So there's been a tendency, I think, to focus on, let's talk it out. Interfaith. Let's get people together with different faith views and we'll talk it out. I'm not saying that's a terrible idea. It's clearly necessary at some point, but we shouldn't expect it to play great dividends in building connection. Most people don't want to talk about theology and politics all the time. They don't want to talk about it very much at all most of the time. Most of us want to do things together. And actually, it's when we do things together that the trust is formed. And what the research shows is there's two particular things that are really useful. One is intensity. So if you can do an intense activity together, so whether it's putting on an event or taking part in a competition or doing something up front that maybe you're a bit nervous about, or just doing something, that's why getting congregations serving together can be quite effective. The second is routine. Doing routinized activity together, again, has a significant impact on how much we trust each other. I think that's why we have meals with people we work with often, and we see the breaking of bread together. I mean, for food is so important, but it's also why religions tend to have ritual in them, because we tend to know that the routine tends to create a sense of connection and trust.
Great, thanks so much. I'm just sort of, as you're saying that, imagining how difficult it is for us in a think tank world to think of a world where people don't want to talk about theology and politics all the time. It's, I can hardly imagine it. I'm going to send some audience questions now because we've got some great ones coming through. We've got a question. COVID has resulted in large number of companies working from home. This will cause less people to meet. Will this increase the speed up of the breakdown in society?
Yeah, so I think my general view on the pandemic's impact on things is we don't really know. I think it's quite tempting to sort of jump in, and the pandemic is the explanation for why I was right all along about whatever it was I believe. I think we don't really know a lot of the impacts of what the pandemic has had. I mean, so the case for it being positive is one of the things I write about in the book. Is that the move to what's often called the knowledge economy. So the fact that most of us can work from home, we can do jobs that involve thinking and writing and talking. One of the things it does is it tends to put together in firms the people who are doing the thinking work in one place. So the researchers, the marketeers, the designers. If you think about a company like Apple, it's probably a good example. And the people doing the manufacturing over here. So where are the Apple phones made? Well, they're not made in California. And so you end up with, by the nature of the way the company works, you end up with sort of people with degrees in one place and people without degrees in another place. And that creates a divide. So the economy is naturally created a divide. And because people don't want to commute very far, they tend to live in those places. If you go back 200 years, when we were more manufacturing, you needed the senior management to live in the same part of the world as the people making the stuff. So therefore, you ended up with more of a geographical mix. Now, in some ways, people being able to work from anywhere, those knowledge workers, could lead to them being spread more around the country, which could be positive. The case for the negative is it's about to change. Like, change is just really disruptive for voluntary things we set up. So all those voluntary groups people have set up at their workplaces that did tend to bring people together, they tend to have been somewhat disrupted. So my general view is we just don't really know what the impact of the pandemic is, but there's sort of reasons for optimism and nervousness, I think, around the impact on the common life.
You'll have to have this event again in a year or two, or maybe that's even too soon, 20 years. So let's find out. That's really helpful. We've got some questions about education coming up. So I'm going to bundle two together because we're a bit short of time. This is possibly unfairly bundling, but you can unbundle. We've got a question about to what extent can schools and education tackle social division? In what ways would you change the education system to facilitate this? And then we've also got a question around whether return to religious studies in the UK schools will start to fix the broken society. So a question about, I suppose that's broadly, what does good religious studies look like in the context of social cohesion?
Yeah, I think schools are very good places to focus. I mean, they're broadly the only institution we have left that, apart from jury service, that we have to be part of. And therefore they are natural places to try and create common life experiences, and children are going through intense things together, whether exams or PE or speaking in public or whatever it might be. What would I do? I mean, I used to be the advisor to the Education Secretary in the UK, so these things are not sort of completely new to me. Look, there is a question about private schools. Would you, if you were starting from scratch, would you have a system where where the wealthiest people tend to be educated separately? I think you probably wouldn't. Now, the only caution with that is that's only 7% of the population, so that leaves 93%. There's a slight danger we over-focus therefore on private schools. The one thing I would do about schools is I would say to anyone who's a school governor, why not reserve 20% of your places for the 20% poorest kids in the country? So 20% of our kids roughly can't afford school meals. The government changed the law about 10 years ago so that schools could reserve places for children on free school meals who might not be able to afford being in the catchment area. I can't see a single reason that someone could say out loud without being embarrassed as to why a school governor wouldn't do that. Why not make it possible to have a more mixed income in your school? A lot of schools already have way more than 20%, but some of the best schools are the people with the money get access to the places, and it creates a lot of the division. So if I could do one thing, I would encourage people to make that policy change in their schools. I think RE is important. Understanding is good. I think it's much better if kids can meet children from other religious backgrounds. There's a great program called the Linking Network that does this and brings together kids from different religious backgrounds and gets them doing stuff together. I think that's more important, actually.
Great, thanks so much. Hopefully we've got some school governors in the audience that can take forward your recommendations. We've got a question here from Sophie Ross. She says, do you think efforts to make our society more cohesive have placed too much of a burden on minorities to integrate rather than everybody else?
Yes, I do think that. Thank you, Sophie. I do think that. I do think there's been a tendency to look at the issue, firstly, to think about the issue as just an issue around race, which I think is the first mistake to make. And then to say, well, we didn't used to have this problem, so therefore those people need to spend more time with us. I think that's, I mean, firstly, I think it's a misdiagnosis of what's going on. But secondly, it's like the way to just set the thing up poorly, because obviously that means that, 85% of the population, I'm talking about the white population, tend to think, well, it's not nothing to do with me. So that's all fine. And then the ethnic minority population tend to think, well, not only am I suffering from like living in a society where things, I think Britain is in many ways a great place to live, but it is not a fair place. And it's not a place without racial difficulty and racial problems. So not only are we saying to people that you've got to cope with those difficulties, but now you've got to fix this problem. So I do think it's not helpful. And the way that I think is much more sensible to think about it is there's lots of difference in our society. Nobody is the neutral. Like everyone is different. I've got ginger hair and glasses. I'm a Christian. I've got a lisp. I'm hiding it quite well. And I'm fascinated by politics. That is quite niche. And actually, there's an issue if I'm just surrounded by people exactly like me. So I would say we've got to think of this as an everybody problem. And that's the best place to start. And then we say, okay, what do we do to bring people together? I think once you start saying, no, it's those people who need to integrate, I think you've got a real difficulty.
Great. On that dealing with difference, we have a question here, which I'm going to broaden out slightly, which is that this is one of our audience members is trying to make worship more varied at the local church, but current members can't seem to get with it. They are reacting with anger or leaving. What can we do? And I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about how we actually practically confront differences. I mean, it's all, so we all know we're all different, but actually that can be quite a painful process to bear those differences and particularly make a common life that everyone feels they can get behind. So I'm interested to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I won't claim to be able to sort of, solve that particular problem, but I do think there is something about trying to just put ourselves in people's shoes as well as we possibly can. And there is a slight tendency, I think, for us to think, I am open-minded. This person is completely unopen to anything. So I was struck on the day after the EU referendum. I promise this is linked. I worked with people who were mostly in their early 20s, who lived in London, who were university graduates. Those people are mostly going to, by the stats, mostly have voted to Remain. And the charity was focused on bridging lines of difference. And I went into the office the day after, lovely people who I count as dear friends, and they were saying to me, John, this is so sad, so awful. How can half the country be so awfully and terribly and evilly intolerant? And I sort of felt the need to say something. I was like, we're talking about half the country. We can't write people off just because they don't have your values. And I think there is a slight tendency to be like, what, I'm very tolerant and open, but it's these people who are so close-minded. And I think the more we can recognize, well, what is the change we would find most difficult? What is the change we would find hardest? I mean, in the very specific example, I think probably depending on the size of the congregation, I think the more you can try and find ways, yes, you do need to meet people's needs, but can there be some sort of coming together that's outside of the service? Can there be some coffee that combines the two? I mean, even better, and some sort of shared event, some sort of mentoring, some sort of thing that connects the more older members of the congregation with the younger. we can over focus, I think, on the service when actually there can be other things that can be designed that both groups would like to be part of.
Thanks so much. We've just got a few more minutes for a final question. I think we'll just see. Let's have, this is a final question. I'm heading up the Believe Network at OVO to promote faith and belief in the workplace. What would be best practice to encourage people to talk about their beliefs? Interested to hear your perspective.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the main thing I think I would always want to say if you're getting people to talk about their beliefs is firstly, try and lead by example. So in most environments, especially a workplace, some people have more power than others. And I'm not in a position of saying that's awful. Actually, it's good. Some people have more power and they have more responsibility, and that's a weight that sits with them. But those people who have that responsibility, the more they can lead off and say, look, I want to talk about my beliefs, this is how it works, and the more they can model, and the more you can get a diverse group of people then following that. So line some people up to go off first obviously lowers the bar a little bit. I think the second thing is back to these divisions that we draw, we tend to think of faith beliefs as being beliefs and everything else as kind of neutral. Everything is a belief. Should we prioritize opening up the pubs considering the state of COVID, or should we prioritize the vulnerable even though the death rate's going down? It's a belief, it's a value. The science can only take you so far. It's a values decision, it's a belief decision. What's more important, justice or mercy? That's a belief. We all have beliefs, and I think the more you can just sort of normalize the fact that even in our differences we have in common that we all believe something. I mean, but the final thought maybe on this is I think we do tend to have a bias to focus on the differences that we have rather than what we have in common. And I think one of my main pushes, I was talking to a friend yesterday who I worked very closely with many years ago. He's a very devout Sunni Muslim. I hope I'm a reasonably devout Christian. We've had a great commonality, not in our precise beliefs. There's things Jawad believes that I just think are wrong, and the things I believe that he just thinks are wrong. But we had a similar commonality about how do we live out this faith? Are we consistent with it? Are we sometimes hypocrites? What does it mean to be real about? There was a commonality there, and I think we can over focus on the difference and miss out on the common.
Thanks so much. Well, we've run out of time, which is a real shame because I know that there have been some unanswered questions there. And one of the things I just want to say, from my perspective, there's a comment on the back of your book that it's deeply wise, meditative, timely and practical. And I feel like that has shone through again in this conversation, that it is both meditative and concerned with the role of the individual and self-reflective, but also is giving us all, I think, and particularly here at Theos, some practical ideas on how to translate what is one of our core beliefs, that relationships really matter. Humans are fundamentally relational. How do we do that in practice? I think that this has been really helpful. So I hope that our attendees have also found it helpful. Apologies to those who we didn't get time to answer your questions. I think that there's going to be some links in the chat for our next events, for John's book, some Theos research, and hopefully that will give you some more to chew on until we meet again. In the meantime, I hope everybody has wonderful days, and I think that's it from us today. So I don't know whether I'm meant to leave the event or who's going to close it, but I guess we're about to find out. Thanks, everybody.